Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern, or breaks with you?
You don't belong in the family photos, my sister said, with a smirk so subtle it could have passed for a smile if you didn't know her like I did, and if you didn't catch that little tilt of her head. The one she used when she wanted to slice you open with words and still pretend she was being polite. She stood there, latte in hand, the steam swirling around her flawless French manicure as if even the heat bowed to her control. Everyone else in the room froze for a second, but no one said anything, not my mother, who suddenly found something fascinating in the pattern of the rug, not my dad, who coughed and stared at the window like he was watching for enemy planes, and not Jared, my older brother, who gave me a quick half-glance before returning to whatever the hell was so interesting on his phone. And me? I just smiled without my teeth, the kind of smile I learned to give during deployments when your face had to stay calm even if your soul was shaking, and I told her no worries. Wouldn't want to ruin the symmetry. But I felt it. I felt every word like a pin pressed into my chest, because this wasn't the first time I'd been cropped out of their perfect little world, and I knew damn well it wouldn't be the last. I hadn't even planned on coming back for Thanksgiving this year. I had said no in the group text twice, flat out, not maybe, not I'll see. No. But then my mom called a week before, and her voice had that tremble in it, that gentle cracking near the end of her sentences, like she was afraid she'd never get another chance to convince me. And even though I knew better, even though I'd promised myself after last year that I wouldn't put myself through it again, I said yes, because she said, "It's just dinner, honey. No drama. Please. No drama." That was always the promise and never the reality. So here I was, standing in the living room of my childhood home, though most of my childhood memories had already been bulldozed and remodeled into this Pottery Barn catalog version that Rebecca insisted on designing herself. Watching everyone pose by the fireplace like some goddamn magazine ad for generational perfection. My sister had coordinated the colors: beige, cream, forest green, something about warm neutrals for the season. She passed out little guidelines on what to wear in the family group chat 2 weeks ahead of time, just like she always did. I wore black. Not out of rebellion, at least not consciously, but because it was the only clean thing in my bag, and I'd flown in straight from a contract security job that had kept me sweating in sand for most of the fall. I didn't care if I matched. I didn't think I'd even be in the picture. And maybe I shouldn't have come, not just to the house, but to the entire damn idea of being part of this family again. The thing about war, real war, is that it makes everything else feel like static. You learn to hear lies in people's tones, to see motives in their eyes before they even open their mouths, and when Rebecca looked at me today, I saw exactly what she was thinking before she said it. "We'll just do one with the original 4 first," she said, eyes bright with the kind of innocence you know is bullshit, but no one else calls out because they're used to pretending it's all normal. Original 4. Like I was a footnote in their history. It's strange, really. I bled for a flag they wrapped themselves in for backyard barbecues. I carried brothers and arms off burning concrete while they argued over gluten-free pie crusts and who brought the wrong wine. And yet, somehow, I was still the outsider. The one who was too quiet. Too intense. Too different. Rebecca once told me I didn't understand how to be part of a family because I didn't do the little things like Christmas cards and matching pajamas. That was the yardstick here. Not sacrifice. Not honor. Not years spent on foreign soil trying to keep people alive. But how well you smiled in a group shot. So I stepped back, like I always do, and let them have their perfect photo. But this time, something in me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, clean break. The kind that doesn't hurt right away, but starts to pulse in the silence later. I watched them pose, Rebecca's hand lightly touching our dad's shoulder, Mom dabbing under her eyes like the moment was too sweet, too important. And I thought, let them have it. Let them keep this curated memory, this fake little bubble. But not for long. Because I had brought something with me. I hadn't intended to show it. Honestly, I'd thrown it into my carry-on at the last second, more out of habit than anything else. It wasn't something I displayed. Hell, I didn't even tell most people about it. But it was mine. Not a gift. Not a hand-me-down. Not something Rebecca could label or color code. It was a thing I earned when my lungs were filled with dust, and I wasn't sure I'd live another minute. And as I stood there, watching the flash go off and hearing the forced laughter echo through the house that hadn't felt like home in over 20 years, I slid my hand into the inside pocket of my coat and let my fingers find the small velvet box. My thumb pressed into its edge, feeling the firmness of it, the weight. I didn't take it out. Not yet. Because revenge, if it's going to be good, has to simmer. It's got to be slow and quiet and timed just right so that when it lands, it doesn't explode. It burns. And they had no idea just how hot things were about to get. There's a strange kind of silence that follows you home from the military, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there long after the dust has settled and the noise has stopped. The kind of silence that doesn't just live in your ears, but curls up somewhere in the middle of your chest, quietly tightening its grip every time someone looks at you and says, "You're back to normal now, right?" As if normal is something you can stitch back together with time, pie, and a polite smile. I never told my family the whole story, not because I wanted to keep secrets and not because they couldn't handle it, though sometimes I think maybe they couldn't, but because I knew deep down they wouldn't understand it the way I needed them to. Wouldn't feel it the way I carried it, and I wasn't interested in explaining myself to people who never saw past what they wanted to believe about me. When I signed up at 24, Rebecca had already made her opinion clear. Her exact words were, "It's a phase, Missy. You always run from things instead of dealing with them. Maybe just try therapy like a normal person." That was her way of offering support, if you can even call it that, laced with superiority, wrapped in concern, but dripping with the unspoken judgment that had been her weapon of choice since we were kids. And back then, maybe I was running from something, I don't know. I'd just ended a toxic engagement. I was sick of bouncing between retail jobs and roommates who didn't clean their dishes, and I was tired of waking up every morning feeling like my life was on pause while everyone else in the family pressed fast forward. But when I walked into that recruitment office, what I felt wasn't fear or recklessness, it was clarity. It was the first time I felt like I was choosing something for me, not because it looked good on paper, not because it made someone else proud, but because I needed to know who I was when everything else got stripped away. 8 years later, I came home with a box of medals I kept zipped up inside an old duffel bag, buried beneath civilian clothes, and a pair of boots I couldn't bring myself to throw out. I didn't hang anything on the wall. I didn't put photos in frames. I didn't tell stories at the dinner table. Not because I was ashamed, far from it, but because I didn't want to play the role of hero in someone else's script when they'd never cared for the reality of the job. They liked the idea of service, the flag-waving, bumper sticker version of it. But not the dirt. Not the guilt. Not the heat that melted your skin or the sound of a child crying in a language you didn't understand while you held pressure on a wound and told yourself it wasn't going to haunt you. They liked to say thank you for your service, as if that phrase meant anything to the dead or the ones who came back without pieces of themselves. Rebecca had said more than once that my service was good, but not real, and I remember that phrase vividly because of the way it landed, soft, like a pillow, but filled with bricks. "You didn't really see combat though, did you?" she asked once during a Christmas brunch, champagne flute in hand, as if asking about some trip I took to Cancun. "I mean, you weren't on the front lines or anything. It's more like support stuff, right? Logistics?" And I just nodded because I didn't have the energy to correct her and because, in some twisted way, letting her believe I'd done nothing of importance gave me a strange sort of power. The less she knew, the less she could fake understanding. But the truth, the real truth, is that it wasn't logistics. It was a convoy in Kandahar that got hit hard in the dead of August, the kind of heat where even breathing feels like swallowing fire, the kind of heat where your body's drenched in sweat before you've even moved. We were transporting supplies, nothing glamorous, nothing that would make headlines, just trying to get from point A to point B when the explosion rocked the side of our vehicle and sent the world into a slow-motion nightmare of metal, screams, and smoke so thick it felt like drowning on dry land. I don't remember every second, I never will, but I remember the sound of my heartbeat screaming in my ears, louder than anything else. And I remember the moment I realized I couldn't hear the soldier beside me yelling for help because one side of my hearing was just gone. Like a switch had been flipped and silence had filled the space where noise should have been. I got out of that vehicle dragging a wounded translator and a private who couldn't move his legs. I don't even know how I did it. People say adrenaline is magic. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just unluck. But I pulled them behind cover, I used what little I remembered from training, and I stayed low until help arrived. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Felt like an hour. When it was over, I was covered in blood that wasn't mine, coughing like my lungs were inside out, with a ringing in my head that never quite left. They gave me a medal for that. Quiet ceremony. No press. Just a few claps, a well done, and a note in my record. I was offered a medical discharge a few months later, and I took it, not because I wanted out, but because I couldn't fake being at 100% anymore, and the worst thing you can do over there is slow down the people counting on you to pull your weight. That medal stayed in its box. I never showed it to my parents. Never mailed a photo home. They knew I was discharged, but I told them it was health-related and left it at that. They didn't ask. I didn't offer. And maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I made it too easy for them to forget what I'd given up. But a part of me hoped, stupidly, that they might ask eventually. That someone, anyone, would want to know who I was beyond the stories Rebecca told about me being distant or emotionally stiff. So when I caught her snooping in my travel bag the night after Thanksgiving, after the photo shoot, after she thought I was asleep upstairs, and I saw her hands lift the velvet box like it was some piece of lost jewelry, I didn't say a word. I just watched from the top of the stairs as she opened it, stared for a second, then quickly shut it and shoved it back under the clothes like it burned her. She never said anything. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even when we locked eyes across the kitchen over coffee, and she gave me that practiced little smile like nothing had happened. But I saw the look in her eyes. That flicker of something, guilt or confusion or maybe just fear, that she couldn't quite hide. And I knew then, the time was coming. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to throw the box at her feet and scream about what it meant. No, that wasn't how I operated anymore. My revenge wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, clean, sharp. And when it landed, it wouldn't need an explanation. Because by then, she'd already know what she was choking on. There is a particular kind of heaviness that settles in the air when people pretend too hard to be comfortable, when every word passed around the table is dressed in civility, but hides a dagger beneath its napkin. And when the laughter that floats between bites of turkey and cranberry sauce feels less like joy and more like an act of denial, so rehearsed it should be listed in the program of a stage play titled, "Let's Pretend We're Fine." That was the mood at dinner that night, the same table where, years ago, I'd learned to cut my food quietly and speak even more quietly. And where every family gathering since I came back had felt like I was sitting in a room that kept shrinking around me while the others pretended it was expanding. The turkey was dry, the green bean casserole had too much salt, the wine was cheap, and still, everyone acted like we were eating at some Michelin-starred affair because that was the game. Smile, chew, sip, and nod, never acknowledge the rot beneath the polished silverware. Rebecca, in her usual way, had taken control of everything from the seating arrangement to the playlist humming in the background, a carefully curated mix of acoustic covers and holiday classics that, I suppose, were meant to convey warmth and sophistication, but only made the room feel colder to me, like a hotel lobby trying too hard to feel like home. She sat at the head of the table, not because anyone assigned her that seat, but because she simply chose it, and no one challenged her, and she'd strategically placed me across from her, like I was some distant cousin visiting from a foreign land. The kind you seat far enough away that you don't have to include in real conversation, but close enough that you can observe if they do anything embarrassing. My parents flanked her sides like loyal bookends, both nodding at whatever she said with the kind of automatic approval that used to make me wonder if I'd been born into the wrong family, or if I'd just missed some secret meeting where they all agreed to pretend Rebecca was the sun we were meant to orbit. Jared sat next to me, which I think was supposed to be a gesture of support, but his eyes barely left his phone except to laugh at Rebecca's jokes, and I knew better than to interpret his presence as anything more than convenient neutrality. That was Jared's gift, staying out of it, floating above the tension like it was none of his business, even when the tension was choking everyone else at the table. The first half of dinner was small talk, weather, Jared's kids, Rebecca's latest PTA triumphs, and my mom's rose bushes, which she spoke about as if she were personally breeding the next generation of floral royalty. No one asked about my work. No one asked how I'd been since leaving the military. Not even a polite, surface-level, "How's civilian life treating you?" And that silence said more than any question could have. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. It was avoidance, coded in politeness, dressed up as respect for my privacy, but really it was about discomfort. My life didn't fit into their version of the world, and rather than stretch themselves to understand it, they just erased it with silence. Then, somewhere between the pumpkin pie and Rebecca's second glass of Chardonnay, the conversation shifted like a car skidding on black ice, suddenly and with just enough warning that I saw it coming but couldn't stop it. "You know, it's so great that you're here this year," she said, smiling across the table like a wolf in pearls. "I mean, you always keep to yourself, so it's nice to have you with us again. Especially now that you're done with your travels." Her voice carried just the right amount of condescension, soft and sugary, like she thought if she kept her tone sweet enough I wouldn't taste the venom underneath. I swallowed a piece of pie that felt like gravel and met her gaze, refusing to blink first. "I wasn't traveling," I said, my voice calm and measured, because I'd learned long ago that losing your temper just gives them what they want. "I was serving." There was a flicker in her expression, just a second of tightness around the eyes, a micro-wrinkle of discomfort, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced with a smile that had more teeth than warmth. "Of course," she said, waving her hand like she was brushing away an inconvenient mosquito. "I just meant, it's nice that you're back now. You've done your part, and you've got the rest of your life ahead of you. Time to think about settling down, maybe getting serious about the future." As if what I'd done was a detour. As if 8 years of giving everything I had was just a chapter in a book she didn't plan to read. I looked around the table and saw my mother stir her coffee nervously, my father frown slightly, but say nothing, and Jared scroll through something on his phone. His thumb flicking past whatever image or update he clearly found more engaging than the unraveling of his own sister. And in that moment, I realized just how alone I was at that table. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually, existentially. Alone in a house full of people who claimed to love me but couldn't bear to acknowledge the parts of me that made them uncomfortable. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine with the air of someone who believed she'd just won an argument no one else knew was happening, and then, with the timing of a magician revealing her final trick, she smiled wide and said, "So I've booked a little family photo session for tomorrow afternoon. Something casual but classy. You know, just the original 4 of us." Original 4. The words hit me like a slap, not because they surprised me, but because of how calculated they were, how casually cruel. She said them with the same tone someone might use to ask for decaf instead of regular, and the worst part was that no one at the table flinched. No one corrected her. No one said, "You mean 5. Not even Jared. They just nodded or looked away, or in my father's case, coughed into his napkin like that would drown out the insult. I didn't react. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm away or demand an apology. I simply folded my napkin, placed it on my plate, and said, "Sounds like a beautiful shot," before standing and quietly walking out into the night air that felt warmer than the dining room I'd just left. But as I stood on the porch, listening to the muffled sound of plates being cleared and the clink of cutlery behind me, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and let my fingers wrap once more around the edges of the metal box I hadn't touched since unpacking. It was still there. Still mine. Still waiting. Tomorrow, they'd take their photo. And I'd give them a moment they wouldn't forget, not because I shouted, and not because I begged for space in a frame that had no room for the truth, but because sometimes the best revenge isn't being included. It's being unforgettable. The morning of the photo shoot arrived dressed in a heavy gray sky, the kind of sky that felt like it was holding its breath before a storm, and while the others stirred around the house in anticipation, fussing over collars and hair and lipstick shades with the energy of people preparing for something they deeply believed mattered. I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, Rebecca's former teenage sanctuary turned sterile spare space, and stared at the contents of my open duffel bag, letting my eyes rest on the small velvet box tucked into the side pocket like it had grown roots there. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the air stale and still, and for a long time I didn't move, just sat there with my back straight and my palms flat against my knees, the same posture I used when preparing for a long mission. Not because I expected danger, but because ritual gives you control, even when control is an illusion. Downstairs, I could hear the familiar sounds of Rebecca's commands being issued like friendly fire, her voice rising and falling in that rehearsed sing-song she used whenever she wanted to seem cheerful while getting her way. And I imagined her standing in front of my father, tugging at the sleeve of his sweater, or barking at Jared about the baby spitting up on his shirt again, or worse, reminding my mother to keep her glasses off her head because they ruin the symmetry of the photo. I didn't need to see it to know it. She was always like that when a camera was involved, desperate for everything to look polished and effortless, as though capturing the image of a perfect family could erase the history that made it a lie. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing simple black pants and a soft gray sweater with sleeves that hid the small scars along my forearms, marks of a life no one here wanted to see or speak about, then pulled my hair into a low, tight braid. Not out of vanity but out of habit, because where I'd come from, hair wasn't for decoration, it was just one more thing you kept in order. There were no matching outfits for me. Rebecca hadn't included me in the wardrobe plan, hadn't sent a message about the color scheme, or the location, or the photographer's name. Her silence had been its own invitation, one I recognized well: come if you must, but understand you're not wanted in the final shot. The photo shoot was set up in the backyard, which Rebecca had transformed into what she likely described as rustic chic, a row of wicker chairs arranged beside a wooden trellis strung with fairy lights, which in the gray daylight looked more sad than festive, and a large floral arrangement positioned carefully behind the seating area, as if a few hydrangeas could frame a broken family into coherence. The photographer, a polite young woman with a camera that probably cost more than my first car, greeted us with a smile that wavered slightly when she saw the dynamic unfolding in front of her, Rebecca issuing directions, my parents standing stiffly, Jared looking exhausted, and me, hovering near the edge like a shadow no one was sure how to place. Rebecca turned toward me, her face stretched into a diplomatic expression that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "We're going to start with the original 4. Just for tradition. You understand, right?" Her voice was too sweet, too rehearsed, the kind of voice used to soften a blow that was always going to land hard no matter how many pleasantries you wrapped it in, and in that moment, time seemed to slow just enough for me to hear the quiet crunch of leaves under my boots as I stepped closer, feel the cool sting of wind against my cheek, and sense the silence behind the camera as everyone waited to see what I would do. I nodded slowly, the kind of nod that wasn't agreement but acknowledgement, a nod that said, "I hear you, and I see exactly what this is," and then, without breaking eye contact, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat, pulled out the velvet box with deliberate calm, and held it out in my open palm, angled just enough for Rebecca to see what it was before I opened it. The metal lay there, glinting faintly under the dull sky, nestled against the black velvet like a secret finally brought into the light, and I watched as her smile faltered, not dramatically, not with gasps or tears, but with a single sharp twitch of her jaw. The kind that happens when a person suddenly finds themselves standing in a moment they can't control. "This was from the country you said I was too weak to serve," I said, my voice quiet but steady, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the carefully arranged scene, and for a moment, no one moved. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words, and my father's gaze dropped to the ground, his hands tightening at his sides. Jared's phone, for once, stayed in his pocket, and even the photographer lowered her camera, instinctively sensing that whatever was happening wasn't something you capture, it was something you witness. Rebecca said nothing. She stood there, rigid, eyes flicking from the metal to my face and back again, her breath visibly shortening like someone struggling to recalibrate their version of reality. And I wondered, for a brief and cruel second, if she'd ever imagined that the sister she'd spent years treating like an afterthought could ever hold something that might outshine her carefully curated image. I didn't wait for her to speak. I closed the box, slipped it back into my pocket, and took a step back, not away in defeat, but back into my space, my truth, my ground. "Take your photo," I said, nodding toward the setup like a general surveying a battlefield. "I'll be over here. Wouldn't want to ruin the symmetry." Then I turned and walked toward the edge of the yard, my back straight, my hands steady, and as I stood beneath the bare branches of the old oak tree that had somehow survived every storm this property had seen, I heard the photographer click the shutter and knew that no matter how perfectly framed that image turned out, there would always be a crack in it, a hairline fracture running straight through the center, where the truth had been momentarily exposed. They could crop me out of their photos, but they'd never be able to crop that moment from their memory. Some things don't end with an explosion. They don't shatter the air or demand witnesses or leave behind the kind of visible wreckage people can gather around and point to as proof that something big happened. Some things end the way smoke fills a room, slowly, subtly, with a creeping permanence that seeps into every fabric and lingers long after the source has disappeared. That's how it felt in the hours after the photo shoot, when the guests had retreated indoors, pretending to busy themselves with leftovers and dishes while the weight of what had just unfolded out in the yard hung between us like a low fog no one could name, but no one could see through, either. I hadn't said anything more after the metal box disappeared back into my coat. I hadn't needed to, and Rebecca, to her credit, hadn't tried to spin the moment or claw back control with a last-minute performance. Her silence was almost disorienting, as if for once the gears inside her head, the ones that usually clicked and whirred to produce the perfect response, had jammed all at once under the sheer force of something she couldn't reduce or ignore. That metal hadn't just been an object, hadn't just been proof of service or bravery or duty, it had been something infinitely more dangerous in her world, undeniable. I watched her from the kitchen window later that evening, standing in the backyard alone, staring at the camera screen as the photographer reviewed the images with her, nodding mechanically at each shot like she couldn't quite focus. And I wondered what it was she saw in them, if she saw the forced smiles, the stiff shoulders, the absence that couldn't be edited out even with the best lighting. Maybe she saw, for the first time, a version of the family she couldn't dress up with autumn leaves and matching flannel. Maybe she saw a fracture. Or maybe, true to form, she saw nothing and chose not to look too closely. Inside, my mother moved around the kitchen with a kind of anxious grace, pulling Tupperware from drawers and talking too much about how full the fridge was, how there wouldn't be room for everything, how the cranberry sauce should have been made from fresh berries like she'd planned. She never looked at me directly, only in sideways glances that flickered with something close to apology, but never quite made it to the surface, and though I didn't resent her, I'd given up resenting her a long time ago. I couldn't help but wonder what it must feel like to carry so much quiet regret and still choose not to speak it aloud. My father stayed seated in the den, a beer resting untouched in his hand, the television on but muted, his eyes fixed on a football game that neither of us had followed for years. He didn't speak to me either, but he didn't leave the room when I entered, and in our world, that passed for progress. Later that night, after the dishes were cleaned and the children asleep and the hum of the dishwasher was the only thing left to fill the silence, Rebecca and I crossed paths in the hallway just outside the guest room. She was holding her phone, thumb scrolling aimlessly, face blank, hair pulled back into a tight knot that reminded me of the way she used to wear it in high school when she wanted to look older than she was. We both stopped, the air between us taut and humming with everything that hadn't been said, and for the first time in what felt like years, she didn't seem prepared. She didn't lead with condescension. She didn't smile. She didn't pretend. "I didn't know," she said finally, voice low, brittle, a statement that carried more weight in what it lacked than in what it offered. I leaned against the wall, arms folded across my chest, and studied her face, the delicate features we'd inherited from the same mother, but somehow worn so differently, hers carved into elegance, mine worn by time and silence. "You never asked," I replied, not unkindly, not with bitterness, but with the simple finality of someone who'd long since stopped expecting bridges to be built where people had only ever put up fences. She nodded once, barely a movement, and opened her mouth as if to speak again, but no words came, and in the end, she turned and walked down the hallway, her footsteps soft and uneven, the sound of them vanishing like mist into the stillness. I stood there for a while, long after she disappeared, the house around me heavy with quiet, and I wondered whether that silence was grief or guilt or just the aftershock of too many years spent pretending we didn't come from different worlds, even though we'd been raised under the same roof. The next morning, I packed my bag without ceremony, folding each piece of clothing with care but no sentiment, and when I zipped the duffel shut, the metal box nestled safely inside. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a steady kind of calm. The kind that comes when you've finally stopped waiting for someone else to define your worth. No one came to say goodbye, not because they were angry, I think, but because they didn't know how to approach the version of me they'd just seen, the one they'd ignored or misunderstood for so long they couldn't speak to her now without stumbling. I walked out the front door as the sun rose pale and hazy over the neighborhood, the same one I used to bike through as a child, dreaming of escape, never realizing that one day I'd return not for reconciliation, but for reckoning. And as I stood at the end of the driveway, duffel over my shoulder, I turned back for just a second, not because I needed to, but because part of me wanted to remember what this house looked like in the moment I finally let go of its hold on me. Inside, on the mantel, I knew they would eventually place that family photo. Rebecca would print it in black and white, frame it in something expensive and tasteful, maybe even post it online with some caption about grateful hearts and timeless memories. And every time she looked at it, every time someone complimented it, she'd smile and say thank you, but deep down, beneath the practiced expressions and curated perfection, she would remember the moment right before the shutter clicked. When I held out that box and shattered her illusion, not with anger, not with blame, but with the simple, unshakable weight of truth. That photo might look perfect, but she would never hang it. Not because I wasn't in it, but because, whether they liked it or not, I would always be the part they couldn't edit out. The one who didn't smile. The one who brought the silence. And the one who finally, unapologetically, belonged.